Montana Territory, 1871. The wind swept across the plains like a banshee's cry, carrying whispers of a land still wild and untamed. A place where law was merely a suggestion and survival required more than just grit, it demanded a hardened heart. For Owen Vance, 25 years old with the weathered soul of a man twice his age, this truth had been carved into him like the jagged scars that decorated the knuckles of his right hand. "A man rides alone in these parts," Owen muttered to his horse as he guided the chestnut gelding along the ridge overlooking Miller's Creek. His lean frame sat easy in the saddle, though nothing about his life had been easy since the war ended. The Montana sunset painted the mountains purple against an amber sky, the beauty lost on a man who believed the frontier offered only two choices: survive alone or die trying. Owen's handsome features, strong jawline shadowed with 2 days' worth of light stubble, deep-set eyes the color of faded denim, remained impassive as he surveyed the valley below. His mother once told him he had a face that could charm the coins from a miser's purse, but charm had no place in his world now, not after Shiloh, not after what he'd seen men do to each other over patches of mud and ideology. The small ranch house appeared like a mirage in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney. The Meadows place. According to the ranch hands at the Rocking W, Old Man Meadows had passed 3 months back, leaving his daughter to fend for herself. Owen had promised his boss he'd stop by to see if the girl needed help with her cattle drive before continuing to Billings. Just business, he reminded himself. Nothing more. The false belief that had sustained him these past years whispered again in his ear. The frontier was no place for connection. Caring for others was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when tomorrow might bring a bullet from a rustler's gun or a knife in the dark. The war had taught him that men were wolves beneath their skin, and the untamed West only stripped away what little civilization remained. What he wanted was simple enough: earn enough money to buy his own spread, far from anyone who might depend on him or whom he might fail. What he needed, well, Owen didn't allow himself to think about that emptiness that woke him in the night, cold and vast as the Montana sky. As the trail dipped down toward the ranch, Owen spotted a figure in the corral, wrestling with what appeared to be a stubborn colt. Even from this distance, he could tell it was a woman. Her skirts had been hitched up in a practical manner, revealing boots and denim trousers underneath, scandalous in any eastern town but necessary for survival here. Her long, honey-blonde hair had come loose from its pins and whipped around her face as she worked with the horse. Owen reined in his mount and watched, impressed despite himself. The young woman moved with confidence, speaking in low tones to the nervous colt. When she finally got the rope over its head, she turned toward the house, and Owen caught his first clear view of her face. 20 years old at most, with features that struck him as both delicate and determined. High cheekbones flushed with exertion, a straight nose, and eyes that even from this distance seemed to challenge the world. She was beautiful in the way of wild things, untamed and wary. When she spotted him, her body tensed. Her hand moved subtly toward her waist, and Owen knew she was reaching for a weapon. Smart girl. "State your business, stranger," she called, her voice carrying clear across the yard. Owen raised one hand slowly. "Owen Vance, ma'am. I ride for the Rocking W, Mr. Whitaker sent me to see if you need help with your herd come roundup time." The woman studied him for a long moment, suspicion evident in her stance. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and precise. "I'm Nora Meadows. And I don't need charity." "Didn't offer any," Owen replied, dismounting with practiced ease. "Mr. Whitaker's offering fair wages for fair work, Miss Meadows, that's all." Something in his blunt honesty seemed to satisfy her. She relaxed slightly, though the wariness never fully left her eyes. "Tie your horse at the rail. I've got coffee inside if you want to discuss terms." As Owen followed her to the modest ranch house, he noticed the firm set of her shoulders, the way she scanned the horizon periodically, the habits of someone who knew the dangers of this country all too well. The ranch was small but well-maintained, signs of a woman fighting to hold onto what was hers in a land that took more often than it gave. Inside the house, everything was neat and practical, with small touches that spoke of a woman's hand: a blue tablecloth, wildflowers in a jar, a quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. Owen removed his hat, feeling unexpectedly awkward as Nora busied herself with the coffee. "My father died in February," she said without preamble, her back to him as she worked the stove. "Pneumonia took him quick." Most of the hands moved on when they heard, figuring I'd sell. I kept on Hank and Caleb, they were loyal to Pa, but 3 people can't manage a full cattle drive. How many head? Owen asked, focusing on business, the solid ground of practicality. 243, she answered promptly. Need to get them to the railhead by end of June. When she turned to face him, coffee pot in hand, Owen was struck by the clarity of her eyes, green as spring grass, direct and unflinching. She wore a simple blouse tucked into those practical trousers, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms tanned by sun and work. Nothing like the delicate Eastern ladies he'd known before the war, with their corsets and fainting spells. "Mr. Whittaker can spare me and 2 others until your cattle are delivered," Owen said, accepting the cup she offered. "We'd take the standard drover's fee." "I can pay, Mr. Vance," she said with quiet dignity. "This ranch may not look like much, but we've managed." "Owen," he corrected automatically. "And I never doubted it, Miss Meadows." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Nora, if we're to work together, we might as well use our given names." The next hour passed in surprisingly easy conversation about cattle prices, grazing lands, and the best route to the railhead. Owen found himself impressed by Nora's knowledge. Clearly her father had raised a daughter to survive in this unforgiving land. As the evening approached, she offered him supper and a place in the bunkhouse for the night. "Can't ride back to the Rocking W before dark," she said practically. "Might as well stay and meet Hank and Caleb. They rode out to check the north pasture but should be back soon." Owen agreed, though something about Nora Meadows unsettled him in ways he couldn't define. Perhaps it was the stubborn independence that mirrored his own, or the glimpses of vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Whatever it was, it threatened the careful walls he'd built around himself since Shiloh. That night, after a simple but hearty meal with Nora and her 2 ranch hands, Hank Townsend, a grizzled man in his 60s, and Caleb Ford, barely 20 with an eager manner, Owen lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to Caleb's soft snoring and Hank's occasional mutterings. His thoughts kept returning to Nora and the quiet strength in her eyes. He told himself it was merely admiration for her grit, nothing more complicated than respect for a fellow survivor in this harsh territory. The last thing Owen needed was to feel responsible for someone else's welfare, to open himself to the inevitable loss that came with caring. The morning dawned clear and cold, typical for spring in Montana territory. Owen rose before the others, years of frontier life having trained him to wake with the first light. He made his way to the main house, intending to thank Nora for her hospitality before heading back to report to Mr. Whittaker. He found her on the porch, rifle across her knees, watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee steaming beside her. "You're up early," she observed without turning. "So are you," he replied, leaning against the porch railing. "Trouble sleeping?" Something flickered across her face, concern perhaps, or simply fatigue, just the usual worries. "Running a ranch isn't easy at the best of times." "And these aren't the best of times," Owen finished for her. She looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing past the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. "No, they're not. There's been cattle missing from the north pasture, not many, 1 or 2 at a time, but enough to notice." "Rustlers?" "Maybe," she frowned, "or maybe someone trying to send a message." "What kind of message?" Nora set her coffee down, her fingers tightening on the rifle. "That a woman can't hold onto land in this territory, that I should sell and move east where proper ladies belong." The bitterness in her voice told Owen this wasn't mere speculation. "Someone's been pressuring you to sell." "James Hollister," she said, the name falling like a stone between them. "Owns the biggest spread east of here. Offered to buy us out when Pa was still alive. When Pa refused, things started happening. Missing cattle, fences cut, nothing that could be proven, of course." The familiar anger stirred in Owen's chest, the kind he'd felt during the war when the powerful preyed on those who couldn't defend themselves. It was the very feeling he'd worked so hard to bury, knowing it would only lead to more pain, more loss. "Has he approached you since your father passed?" Owen asked, keeping his voice neutral. "His lawyer came by with an offer." Nora's jaw tightened. "Half what this place is worth. When I refused, he said I'd regret trying to make it on my own. That a woman needs protection in these parts." The threat beneath those words was unmistakable. Before Owen could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. 3 riders appeared from the direction of the main road, the lead rider a tall man in an expensive coat, flanked by 2 rough-looking companions. "Speak of the devil," Nora muttered, rising to her feet, rifle held casually but ready. Owen straightened, instinctively moving to stand slightly in front of her. He recognized the center man immediately, James Hollister, cattle baron and self-proclaimed king of this part of the territory. The 2 men flanking him had the hard eyes of hired guns. "Miss Meadows," Hollister called, his voice carrying the artificial pleasantness of a snake oil salesman. "Lovely morning for a visit, isn't it?" "State your business, mister." Hollister, Nora replied coldly. "I've got work to do." Hollister's gaze slid to Owen, his expression hardening. "I wasn't aware you'd hired new help, or is this gentleman something more personal?" The insinuation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Owen felt Nora stiffen beside him. "Mr. Vance works for the Rocking W," she said evenly. "He's here to discuss business arrangements." "Ah, Whitaker's outfit," Hollister nodded, studying Owen with newfound interest. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Vance. They say you're fast with a gun." Owen kept his expression neutral. "I'm just a cowhand, Mr. Hollister." "Modest too," Hollister smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Well, I won't interrupt your business discussions. I merely wanted to inform Miss Meadows that my offer still stands. In fact, given the difficulties of managing a ranch alone, I'm willing to increase it by 10%. "Still not interested," Nora replied flatly. Hollister's false pleasantness slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "The cattle market is unpredictable, Miss Meadows. Prices falling, dangers increasing. A woman alone could face all manner of accidents." Owen stepped forward, his hand deliberately away from his holster, but his stance making his intention clear. "Sounds like you're concerned for Miss Meadows' welfare. Rest assured, she won't be facing those dangers alone." The tension crackled between them like summer lightning. Finally, Hollister tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Just being neighborly. Good day, Miss Meadows, Mr. Vance." As the 3 men rode away, Nora let out a long breath. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" Owen asked, though he knew perfectly well. "Put yourself between me and Hollister." Her green eyes flashed with a mixture of gratitude and annoyance. "I've been handling him for months." "I've no doubt you can handle yourself," Owen replied, surprising himself with his candor. "But some men only understand one language, the threat of another man's gun." Nora studied him, her expression unreadable. "And are you threatening Mr. Vance?" The question hung between them, loaded with meanings Owen wasn't prepared to examine. "I should get back to the Rocking W," he said instead. "I'll talk to Mr. Whitaker about the cattle drive. We can have men here by week's end." Something like disappointment flickered in Nora's eyes before she nodded briskly. "Thank you, I appreciate the help." As Owen mounted his horse and rode away from the Meadows ranch, he found himself looking back more than once at the diminishing figure of Nora standing on her porch, rifle still in hand. The encounter with Hollister had shifted something in him, awakened protective instincts he'd thought long dead. "Just business," he reminded himself again, though the words rang hollow even in his own ears. When Owen returned to the Rocking W, he found Mr. Whitaker agreeable to lending men for Nora's cattle drive. The older rancher had been friends with Nora's father and seemed genuinely concerned for the young woman's welfare. "Hollister's been circling that property like a vulture," Whitaker confided as they sat in his office. "That stretch along Miller's Creek has the best water access for miles. He's been buying up all the small spreads in the area." "By fair means or foul?" Owen asked, remembering Nora's missing cattle. Whitaker's weathered face darkened. "Let's just say men who refuse his offers have a tendency to face difficulties. Nothing that can be pinned on Hollister directly. The man's careful. And the law?" "Sheriff Jenkins," Whitaker snorted, "man's in Hollister's pocket, won't lift a finger unless there's proof, and there never is." Owen nodded unsurprised. He'd seen enough of the frontier to know that justice often belonged to whoever had the most money or the most guns, usually both. "You'll head back there tomorrow," Whitaker said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Take Johnson and Peters with you. Stay until those cattle are safely delivered to the railhead. Yes, sir, Owen agreed, ignoring the small voice warning him that getting involved with Nora Meadows and her troubles was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. The next morning, Owen and two other rocking W hands, Steady Ben Johnson and young Mike Peters, rode out for the Meadows Ranch. They arrived by midday to find Nora and Caleb mending a broken corral fence, while Hank worked with the horses in the paddock. Nora straightened when she saw them approach, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her face flushed with exertion. The simple cotton shirt she wore was rolled to the elbows, revealing the same tanned forearms Owen had noticed before. "Mr. Whittaker sent 3 of you?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, though Owen detected a note of relief beneath it. "Best men he has," Owen replied, dismounting. "Ben Johnson and Mike Peters. They've both driven cattle from here to Wyoming and back." After introductions were made, Nora invited them to settle in the bunkhouse and join her for supper to discuss the details of the drive. As Owen helped unload their gear, he caught Ben watching him with a knowing look. "What?" Owen asked, perhaps more sharply than intended. Ben, a man of few words but considerable wisdom earned over his 45 years, simply shrugged. "Nothing, just noticing that Miss Meadows is a mighty fine-looking woman." "That's not why we're here," Owen said firmly. "Course not," Ben agreed easily. "We're here for the cattle, just making an observation is all." Owen didn't dignify this with a response, though he was uncomfortably aware that he'd noticed far more about Nora Meadows than was proper for a business arrangement. Over the next few days they fell into a rhythm of work, checking the herd, preparing for the drive, repairing equipment. Owen found himself working alongside Nora more often than not, impressed by her knowledge and determination. She never asked for special treatment because of her gender, working as hard as any man and sometimes harder. One evening, a week after their arrival, Owen found Nora alone in the barn, examining the hoof of a lame mare. Without being asked, he knelt beside her, his hands joining hers in the gentle examination. "Stone bruise," he diagnosed after a moment, "should heal in a few days if she stays off it." Nora nodded, her shoulder brushing his as they worked together in the lantern light. "That's what I thought. Can't afford to lose a good horse before the drive." "You've done well," Owen said quietly. "Keeping this place running after your father passed, many would have given up." She looked up at him, surprise evident in her green eyes. "This ranch is all I have, all I've ever wanted." "Your father taught you well," Owen observed, helping her wrap the mare's hoof. A shadow passed over Nora's face. "Pa wanted sons," she admitted, her voice low. "Got me instead. Said if I was all he had, I'd better learn to be twice as tough as any boy." "He succeeded," Owen said, meaning it as a compliment. Nora's smile was tinged with something like sadness. "Being tough isn't always enough out here, is it? Sometimes you need more than just grit, you need allies." The word hung between them, a recognition of what they were becoming to each other, whether Owen wanted to admit it or not. He found himself wanting to tell her about Shiloh, about the men he'd seen die because he hadn't been quick enough, strong enough, about the weight of failure that had driven him west, seeking a life where he'd be responsible for no one but himself. Instead, he simply nodded. "Everyone needs someone at their back in this country." "Even you, Owen Vance?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his. The question struck too close to the armor he'd built around himself. "I should check on the horses for tomorrow," he said, rising abruptly. "Early start." He felt her eyes on his back as he walked away, and the disappointment in her gaze was almost tangible. That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the sounds of the other men sleeping, Owen confronted the uncomfortable truth that Nora Meadows was becoming more than just an employer to him. She was becoming a temptation, a reason to believe that perhaps the frontier didn't have to be faced alone after all. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened everything he'd convinced himself was necessary for survival. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Caleb rode in at dawn, his horse lathered and his young face tight with anger. "Fence cut on the north boundary," he reported as they gathered in the yard. 20 head missing, at least." "Hollister," Nora said, her voice flat with certainty. Owen saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the porch railing. "We'll track them," he said, already moving toward the stable. "Ben, get the rifles." Mike, fresh horses. No, Nora said sharply, not all of you. We need to keep preparing for the drive. Owen and I will check the fence. Caleb, you show Ben and Mike what still needs doing here. Her tone brooked no argument, and Owen found himself riding beside her an hour later, following Caleb's directions to the cut fence line. They rode in silence, the tension between them from the previous night still unresolved. The damage was clear when they arrived, fence posts hacked down, wire cut with deliberate malice. Nora dismounted, crouching to examine the ground. 4 riders, she said, pointing to the tracks, headed east toward Hollister's property, of course. We could follow, Owen suggested, though he knew what her answer would be. And then what? Confront Hollister with no proof but hoofprints, Nora shook her head. He'd deny it, might even have men waiting, hoping we'd do exactly that. She was right, and they both knew it. This was a calculated move, not just to steal cattle, but to provoke a response that would give Hollister the upper hand. He's getting bolder, Owen observed, helping her gather the cut wire. First a few cattle at a time, now 20 head at once. He thinks I'm desperate, Nora replied, her jaw set in determination, that I'll give up and sell if he applies enough pressure. Are you? Owen asked quietly. Desperate. She looked at him then, her green eyes bright with defiance. I'm angry, Owen, there's a difference. They worked together to make temporary repairs to the fence, enough to keep the rest of the herd contained until they could return with proper tools. As they mounted to ride back to the ranch house, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, promising an afternoon storm. We should hurry, Owen said, eyeing the thunderheads. That looks like it could turn nasty. They pushed their horses harder, but the storm moved faster. The first heavy raindrops began falling when they were still a mile from the ranch, quickly becoming a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Thunder cracked overhead, startling both horses. There's an old line shack just ahead, Nora called over the storm's roar, pointing to a barely visible structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. We can wait it out there. The abandoned line shack was little more than a single room with a rusted stove and a narrow cot, but it was dry. Owen secured the horses under the small lean-to attached to the side while Nora searched for anything to start a fire. Found some old matches and kindling, she reported when he entered, dripping water onto the plank floor. Should be enough to take the chill off. They worked together in companionable silence, Owen clearing the rusted chimney while Nora arranged the kindling in the stove. Soon, a small fire cast wavering light through the shack's interior, throwing their shadows against the rough walls. Nora had removed her soaked jacket, hanging it near the stove to dry. Her shirt clung to her, damp from the rain, outlining the gentle curves she usually kept hidden beneath practical clothing. Owen forced himself to look away, focusing instead on removing his own wet coat. Your shirt's soaked through, Nora observed, her voice carefully neutral. There's a blanket on the cot. You should change before you catch your death. Owen hesitated, then nodded. Propriety meant little compared to pneumonia in these mountains. He turned his back, unbuttoning his sodden shirt and draping it beside his coat. The rough wool blanket was threadbare but dry, and he wrapped it around his shoulders before turning back to find Nora watching him with an unreadable expression. The storm's not letting up, she said, moving to peer out the single grimy window. Might be here a while. The small space suddenly felt intimate, charged with an awareness neither of them had acknowledged. Owen joined her at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I never thanked you properly, Nora said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the rain lashing against the glass, for coming to help with the drive. For standing up to Hollister. Just doing my job, Owen replied automatically. She turned to face him, challenge in her eyes. Is that all it is, Owen, just a job? The question stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. In this isolated shack with rain drumming on the roof and thunder rolling across the mountains, the pretense that he felt nothing for Nora Meadows seemed suddenly impossible to maintain. No, he admitted, his voice rough. It's not just a job. Something softened in her expression. Then what is it? Owen struggled to find words for feelings he'd denied even to himself. I came west to be alone, he finally said, after the war. After what I saw at Shiloh, I convinced myself that caring for anyone was a liability I couldn't afford. And now, Nora asked softly, now I'm not so sure. He met her gaze directly. You make me question everything I thought I knew about surviving out here. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, revealing vulnerability beneath her usual strength. I've been alone since Pa died, she said. Telling myself I could manage everything if I was just tough enough, smart enough. But the truth is, Owen, I'm tired of fighting alone. The admission seemed to cost her, pride warring with honesty in her eyes. Owen recognized the struggle, so similar to his own. You're not alone anymore, he said, the words a commitment he hadn't planned to make but found he couldn't withhold. The space between them seemed to contract, the air heavy with unspoken possibility. When Nora reached out, her fingers brushing his where they rested on the windowsill, the simple touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. The war broke something in you, she said, her insight striking uncomfortably close to truth. I can see it sometimes when you think no one's watching. Owen didn't deny it. I lost men under my command. Boys barely old enough to shave, looking to me to keep them safe. I couldn't. That's why you keep everyone at arm's length, Nora nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're afraid of failing someone again. The rain continued its steady drumming, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. Owen found himself telling her about Shiloh, the chaos, the mud, the faces of young men who'd trusted him. Things he'd never shared with another living soul came pouring out, and Nora listened without judgment, her hand still touching his. When he finally fell silent, emotionally spent, she squeezed his fingers gently. The past doesn't have to define your future, Owen, she said quietly, not unless you let it. Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder growing more distant. They remained by the window, neither willing to break the connection that had formed between them. When Nora finally spoke again, her voice was soft but determined. I have ghosts too, she admitted, things I haven't told anyone. Owen waited, giving her the same space she'd offered him. Pa wasn't always kind, she said finally, the words clearly difficult. He was a hard man, harder after Ma died, used his fists when words didn't work, taught me to be tough, yes, but also taught me to fear weakness. To hide it at all costs. Anger flared in Owen's chest at the thought of anyone raising a hand to Nora, but he kept his voice gentle. Is that why you're so determined to hold onto this ranch? To prove you're not weak. She considered this, then shook her head slowly. No, I'm fighting for it because it's mine, because despite everything I love this land. The ranch is the only place I've ever belonged. The simple truth of her statement resonated deeply with Owen. Belonging, wasn't that what he'd been searching for since the war ended? Not just a place to exist, but somewhere to truly belong. Thank you, he said, for trusting me with that. Nora's smile was small but genuine. Seems only fair after you trusted me with your ghosts. The rain had dwindled to a gentle patter, and sunlight began breaking through the clouds. Their moment of shelter was coming to an end, the real world waiting to intrude. Neither moved immediately, reluctant to leave the understanding they'd found. Finally, Owen straightened, retrieving his shirt, now merely damp rather than soaked. We should head back. The others will be worried. They rode back to the ranch in a companionable silence, the shared confidences creating a bond between them that hadn't existed before. As they approached the ranch house, however, Owen sensed immediately that something was wrong. The yard was too quiet, the usual sounds of work absent. Hank met them at the barn, his weathered face grim. We've got trouble, he said without preamble. Hollister sent his lawyer while you were gone. Left papers claiming 20 head of his cattle somehow wandered onto our land, and were to surrender them or face legal action. That's ridiculous, Nora spat, dismounting in a fluid motion. He's the one stealing from us. That ain't all, Hank continued. Sheriff Jenkins rode out with him, said he'd be back tomorrow to oversee the return of Hollister's property. Owen exchanged a look with Nora, reading the fury and determination in her eyes. He's making his move, he said quietly, using the law to steal what he wants. I won't let him, Nora declared, striding toward the house. This is my land, my herd. He doesn't get to take either. That evening, as they gathered around Nora's kitchen table to discuss strategy, the tension was palpable. Young Mike seemed nervous, glancing frequently at the windows as if expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. Ben and Caleb maintained stoic expressions, while Hank's face was creased with worry beneath his grizzled beard. If the sheriff's involved, we can't just refuse, Ben pointed out pragmatically. That's asking for more trouble than we can handle. We could move the herd early, Caleb suggested. Get them out before the sheriff arrives tomorrow. Nora shook her head. We're not ready for the drive yet. And running looks like guilt. What if we could prove Hollister is the thief? Owen asked, an idea forming. Turn the tables on him. All eyes turned to him. How? Nora asked. The cattle he's claiming wandered onto your land. They don't exist, Owen explained. But the 20 head missing from your north pasture are real, if we could find them on his property with your brand. That would be proof, Nora finished, understanding dawning. But how do we find them? Hollister's ranch is huge. I know his operation, Ben spoke up. Worked there briefly before coming to the Rocking W. He keeps newly acquired cattle in the holding pens near Blackwater Creek until they can be rebranded. The plan took shape quickly. Owen and Ben would ride to Hollister's ranch under cover of darkness, locate the stolen cattle if possible, and bring back evidence of Hollister's theft before the sheriff arrived the next day. It's dangerous, Nora said when the others had gone to prepare, leaving her alone with Owen in the kitchen. If Hollister's men catch you on his property. They won't, Owen assured her, though they both knew the risk was real. Nora's hand found his across the table, her fingers warm and strong. Be careful, she said simply. The night was clear and cold, the storm having washed the sky clean of clouds, leaving a canopy of stars to guide Owen and Ben as they made their way toward Hollister's property. They rode in silence, taking a circuitous route to approach from the west, where Ben said the security was lighter. The holding pens should be just beyond that rise, Ben whispered as they dismounted, tethering their horses in a small grove of trees. If the stolen cattle are anywhere, that's where they'll be. They moved on foot, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. The Hollister ranch was well lit near the main house, but the outlying areas remained in darkness. As they crested the small hill Ben had indicated, Owen saw the holding pens below, illuminated by a single lantern where a guard sat smoking. Just one man, Ben murmured, might be our lucky night. They watched for several minutes, ensuring no one else was nearby. The guard's posture suggested boredom rather than vigilance, his shoulders slumped, occasionally taking a swig from a flask at his hip. I'll create a distraction, Ben said. You check the cattle for Nora's brand. Before Owen could argue, Ben had slipped away, circling around to approach the pens from the opposite direction. A few minutes later, the crack of a branch breaking echoed in the night, followed by what sounded like a horse moving through underbrush. The guard straightened, peering into the darkness. Who's there? He called, drawing his pistol. When the sounds continued, moving away from the pens, the guard cursed and followed, disappearing into the shadows. Owen moved quickly, slipping down to the pens. Inside were about 30 cattle, most bearing Hollister's brand. But as he moved among them, checking each animal by the dim light of the abandoned lantern, he found what he was looking for, 7 heads still carrying Nora's distinctive M brand. Quickly, Owen used his knife to cut several tufts of hair from these animals, preserving the brand beneath as evidence. He was completing this task when a voice froze him in place. Well, what do we have here? A rustler caught in the act. Owen turned slowly to find 2 men watching him, rifles aimed at his chest. Neither was the guard who had left his post. These were different men, and from their hard eyes and professional stance, they were Hollister's enforcers rather than regular ranch hands. I'm not stealing anything, Owen said calmly, though his mind was racing. Where was Ben? Had they caught him too? No, just taking a midnight stroll through another man's cattle pens, the taller man snorted. Hands up, friend, mister. Hollister will want to have a word with you. Owen raised his hand slowly, the tufts of hair still clutched in his left. I'm just looking for stolen property. Those cattle bear the Meadows brand. Seems to me they're in Hollister's pens, which makes them Hollister's cattle, the second man said, moving forward to relieve Owen of his pistol. Now move and don't try anything heroic. They marched him toward the main house, a sprawling structure that spoke of Hollister's wealth and ambition. Owen's mind worked furiously, looking for any opportunity to escape. If he could just get word to Nora before morning, before the sheriff arrived. Look what we found by the holding pens, boss. the taller man announced as they entered a well-appointed study where James Hollister sat at a massive desk, ledger open before him. Caught him examining the cattle. Hollister looked up, a smile spreading across his face that never reached his cold eyes. "Mr. Vance, I can't say I'm surprised. Miss Meadows seems to inspire a certain misguided loyalty in her employees." "Those cattle bear her brand," Owen said flatly. "You're a thief, Hollister." The rancher's smile didn't falter. Strong accusations from a man caught trespassing. "I wonder what Sheriff Jenkins would make of finding you on my property in the middle of the night." "Probably the same thing he'll make of finding Meadows' cattle in your pens," Owen countered, holding up the tufts of hair with their telltale brands. Something dangerous flickered in Hollister's eyes. "Unfortunately for Miss Meadows, those cattle won't be in my pens by morning, and you won't be around to make accusations." The threat was clear. Owen tensed, ready to fight despite the guns trained on him, when a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Shouts and the sound of running feet preceded a sharp knock at the study door. "What is it?" Hollister snapped. A breathless ranch hand burst in. "Fire, sir, the west stable is burning." Hollister rose, his face darkening with rage. "How?" "Get every man on it. Those horses are worth more than your worthless lives." In the momentary confusion, Owen made his move. He drove his elbow into the stomach of the man holding him, simultaneously ducking and twisting to avoid the second man's grasp. Snatching his confiscated pistol from the stunned guard's belt, Owen backed toward the door. "Stay back," he warned, keeping the gun trained on Hollister. "I'm walking out of here." Hollister's face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this, Vance, you and the Meadows woman both." "Send your threats to the territorial marshal," Owen replied, the tufts of branded hair still clutched in his free hand. "I'm sure he'll be interested to hear about your business practices." Outside, the stable fire created perfect cover for his escape. Men rushed about with buckets of water, shouting instructions and curses. Owen slipped through the chaos, making his way back toward the holding pens where he hoped Ben would be waiting. He found his friend crouched in the shadows, a satisfied grin visible even in the dim light. "Figured you might need a distraction," Ben said by way of greeting. "Hay fires can be mighty attention-grabbing." "You could have been killed," Owen said, though relief made the admonishment weak. Ben shrugged. "So could you." "Did you find what we needed?" Owen opened his hand, showing the tufts of hair with Nora's brand clearly visible. 7 of her cattle at least, but Hollister knows we were here. He'll move them before morning. "Then we'd better get this evidence to Miss Meadows quick," Ben said, already moving toward where they'd left their horses, "and hope it's enough." They rode hard through the night, taking a direct route back to the Meadows ranch. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they arrived, finding Nora waiting anxiously on the porch, rifle across her knees. She rose as they dismounted, relief washing over her features. "I was beginning to think," she didn't finish the thought, instead asking, "Did you find them?" Owen held out the evidence. 7 head still with your brand. Hollister knows we were there, though. He'll have moved them by now. Quickly, he recounted their adventure, watching Nora's expression harden as he described Hollister's threats. "Will it be enough?" she asked, examining the tufts of hair. "The sheriff is Hollister's man. He might simply dismiss this." "Not if we go over his head," Owen said. "The territorial marshal is due in Billings next week for circuit court. We can present this evidence directly to him." "And until then," Nora asked. "The sheriff will be here today, demanding 20 head that don't exist." "We stall," Ben suggested. "Tell him we need time to gather the cattle, buy enough days to get to the marshal." Nora nodded slowly. "It might work. But Hollister won't sit idle once he realizes what we're doing." "Then one of us needs to leave for Billings immediately," Owen decided. "Today, while the rest prepare for the cattle drive as planned." "I'll go," Ben volunteered. "I'm the oldest hand here, can testify to the Meadows brand and what we saw at Hollister's place." They agreed, and Ben departed within the hour, taking a roundabout route to avoid being followed. The rest of them prepared to face Sheriff Jenkins, who arrived mid-morning accompanied by Hollister's lawyer and 2 deputies. "Miss Meadows," Jenkins greeted her with false courtesy. "I believe you've been informed of the situation regarding Mr. Hollister's cattle." Nora stood on her porch straight-backed and proud, with Owen and the other hands flanking her. "I've been informed of Mr. Hollister's claims," she replied coolly. "They're false." The lawyer stepped forward, a thin man with calculating eyes. "We have witnesses who will testify to seeing Hollister cattle on your land, Miss Meadows." "Convenient," Nora observed. "Just as it's convenient that 20 of my cattle disappeared from the north pasture recently. Cattle that were seen last night in Mr. Hollister's holding pens, still bearing my brand." The sheriff's expression tightened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Meadows. Do you have proof?" "We do," Owen stated, stepping forward with the tufts of hair, "and the territorial marshal will receive it next week, along with sworn statements from witnesses." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Jenkins' face. The marshal was beyond Hollister's influence, and accusations of cattle rustling were taken seriously in the territory. "In the meantime," Nora continued, "we're preparing for our cattle drive. If Mr. Hollister wishes to pursue his claims through proper legal channels, he's welcome to do so, but no cattle will be leaving this property today except under my authority." The standoff lasted several tense moments before Jenkins finally nodded curtly. "Very well, Miss Meadows, but this isn't over." "No," Nora agreed, her voice steady, "it isn't." After the sheriff and his party departed, Nora turned to Owen, her expression troubled despite their small victory. "Hollister won't let this go, and the marshal might not arrive in time to stop whatever he's planning next." "Then we accelerate our plans," Owen decided. "We start the drive tomorrow, not next week. Get the cattle to the railhead before Hollister can make another move." That evening, as they finalized preparations for the early departure, Owen found Nora in her father's study, a small room off the main parlor where ledgers and ranch records were kept. She was sitting at the desk, a small wooden box open before her, examining what looked like old letters. "Everything all right?" he asked from the doorway, not wanting to intrude. Nora looked up, and in the lamplight her face seemed both younger and wearier than he'd ever seen it. "Just looking at some of Pa's papers," she said, "trying to make sure I haven't overlooked anything that might help us." Owen entered the room, his gaze drawn to the box. It was finely made, with a brass lock and hinges. Something about it struck him as familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. "Find anything useful?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Nora shook her head. "Just old correspondence, mostly. Pa wasn't much for keeping records." She sighed, running her fingers over the edge of the box. "This was his private box, always kept it locked. After he died, I found the key in his pocket watch." Owen's attention sharpened, focusing on the small seal embossed on the box's lid. An eagle with outstretched wings, clutching arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other. Recognition dawned, sending a jolt through him. "That seal," he said, his voice strange even to his own ears. "Where did your father get this box?" Nora looked up at him, surprised by his sudden intensity. "I don't know. He always had it as far as I can remember. Why?" Owen reached out, his fingers tracing the emblem. "Because I've seen this seal before. It belonged to the 4th Illinois Infantry, my regiment during the war." Understanding dawned in Nora's eyes. "You think Pa served with you? That can't be right. He was too old for the war." "Not necessarily with me," Owen clarified. "The 4th Illinois was at Shiloh, where I served as a lieutenant. These boxes were given to officers to keep important documents." Nora frowned, sorting through the letters in the box. "That doesn't make sense. Pa never mentioned serving in the war. He always said he spent those years ranching in Colorado." "May I?" Owen asked, gesturing to the papers. When Nora nodded, he carefully examined the contents of the box. Among the various documents and letters was a folded piece of paper that caught his attention, official military stationery bearing the Union Army letterhead. Owen opened it carefully, reading the faded text with growing disbelief. "This is a commendation," he said slowly, "for bravery at the Battle of Shiloh, signed by General Grant himself." He looked up at Nora, shock evident in his expression. "But it's not made out to John Meadows, it's for a Captain Michael Reynolds." Nora paled, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "That's not possible. There must be some mistake." Owen continued searching through the papers, finding additional military documents all bearing the same name. "There's a discharge paper here, honorable discharge due to wounds received at Vicksburg, and he paused, extracting a small daguerreotype photograph. This appears to be Captain Reynolds. The image showed a younger version of the man Owen had briefly met before his death, Nora's father. There was no mistaking the stern features, though they lacked the lines and weathering of later years. "I don't understand," Nora whispered, staring at the photograph. "Why would Pa have another man's military papers? Why would he keep them locked away?" Owen's mind raced, fitting pieces together. "Maybe they weren't another man's papers," he said carefully. "Maybe your father was Michael Reynolds." "That's ridiculous," Nora protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why would he change his name?" "Many men did after the war," Owen replied, "especially if they were running from something." Nora sat back, her face troubled. "Running from what?" Owen hesitated, then said gently, "I don't know. But there's one way to find out." He extracted another letter from the bottom of the box, this one in a feminine hand. "This is addressed to Captain Reynolds from someone named Elizabeth. Dated 1863. With trembling fingers, Nora took the letter and began to read. As her eyes scanned the page, the color drained from her face. When she finished, she looked up at Owen, shock and confusion warring in her expression. "This Elizabeth, she writes as if she were my mother," Nora said, her voice barely audible. "She mentions being with child, a daughter. She begs Michael to leave the war behind, to come home to them." "Your mother's name was Elizabeth?" Owen asked softly. Nora nodded. "Elizabeth Meadows. She died when I was 5, fever." She looked down at the letter again. "But if this is true, if my father was Michael Reynolds, then everything I thought I knew about him was a lie." Owen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not everything. He was still the man who raised you, who taught you to survive on the frontier." "A man with secrets," Nora said bitterly. "A man hiding from his past." She looked up suddenly, a new thought occurring to her. Could Hollister know? Could that be why he's so determined to drive me off this land? It was a disturbing possibility. If John Meadows had been living under a false identity, it could explain his reclusiveness, his hardness, always fearing discovery. "We need to be careful," Owen said. "If Hollister does know something about your father's past, he might use it against you." Nora gathered the papers with determined movements, replacing them in the box. "It doesn't change anything," she declared, though Owen could see the hurt behind her bravado. "This is still my ranch, my land. Whatever my father's name was, he left it to me, and I intend to keep it." Owen nodded, respecting her resilience even as he worried about what other secrets might be hidden in John Meadows or Michael Reynolds' past. They left at dawn the next morning, driving the cattle northeast toward the railhead at Billings. With Owen, Nora, and 4 hands managing nearly 250 head, the work was grueling. Each day began before sunrise and ended long after dark, with barely enough time for meals and a few hours' rest. Owen found himself constantly at Nora's side, impressed by her skill and endurance. She rode as well as any man, handled the cattle with expert precision, and never complained despite the blistering sun and choking dust. In the brief moments of respite, when they stopped to water the herd or make camp for the night, he caught her watching the horizon behind them, worry etched on her features. "Expecting trouble?" he asked on the 3rd evening, joining her where she stood apart from the others. "Hollister won't let us reach Billings without trying something," she replied, her voice low. "It's been too quiet." Owen couldn't disagree. The drive had proceeded smoothly, suspiciously so, given Hollister's threats. "Ben should have reached the marshal by now," he offered as comfort. "Even if Hollister makes a move, it's just a matter of holding out until the law is on our side." Nora nodded, though the tension didn't leave her shoulders. In the firelight, with her hair loose from its usual braid and her face softened by exhaustion, she looked younger, more vulnerable. The discovery about her father's identity had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "Do you ever think about after?" she asked suddenly. "After what?" Owen replied, though he understood her meaning. "After the drive, after Hollister." She turned to face him fully. "What then, Owen?" The question hung between them, laden with implications. Owen had been avoiding thoughts of after since meeting Nora, knowing that confronting his growing feelings for her would mean confronting the beliefs that had guided him since the war. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted, the half-truth sitting uncomfortably on his tongue. Nora's eyes, reflecting the campfire's glow, searched his face. haven't you? Because I have. The simple honesty of her statement caught him off guard. Before he could respond, one of the hands called from the edge of camp. Riders coming, at least 6 of them. All thoughts of the future vanished as they moved quickly to defensive positions. Owen helped Nora take cover behind the chuck wagon, both of them drawing their weapons as the approaching riders came into view. Through the gathering dusk, Owen recognized Hollister at the head of the group, flanked by the same hard-eyed men who had captured Owen at the holding pens. They reined in a cautious distance from camp, just beyond easy shooting range. "Evening, Miss Meadows," Hollister called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Fine, heard you're moving." "State your business, Hollister," Nora replied coldly, her rifle steady in her hands. "We've got a long day tomorrow." Hollister smiled, the expression lacking any warmth. "I've come with a proposition. One last chance to sell your ranch at a fair price and avoid unpleasantness." "Not interested," Nora said flatly. "Now ride on before we mistake you for rustlers." "You misunderstand, Miss Meadows. This isn't just about your ranch anymore." Hollister's smile faded. "It's about your father's crimes." Owen felt Nora stiffen beside him. "My father committed no crimes," she stated, though her voice held a note of uncertainty that only Owen, standing close beside her, could detect. "Michael Reynolds was wanted for murder in Illinois," Hollister announced, his voice carrying to ensure all the hands heard. "Killed a man in cold blood after the war, then fled west with a new name. I have proof, enough to see his property confiscated by the state, even posthumously." The revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Owen glanced at the other hands, seeing confusion and unease on their faces. "He's lying," Nora said, loud enough for her men to hear. "Don't listen to him." Hollister reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. "I have here a copy of the warrant for Reynolds' arrest. I've already sent the original to the territorial authorities. By the time you reach Billings, they'll be waiting to seize your cattle and ranch as proceeds of crime." "That's not how the law works," Owen countered, stepping forward. "Even if what you say is true, Miss Meadows isn't responsible for her father's actions." "Perhaps not," Hollister conceded with false reasonableness, "but the courts move slowly, Mr. Vance, very slowly." "During which time Miss Meadows would have no income, no means to maintain her property. How long could she hold out? A year, 2, all while her father's name is dragged through the mud as a murderer and fugitive." Owen saw the calculation behind Hollister's strategy. Even if the legal claim eventually failed, the process itself could break Nora financially and emotionally. It was clever, using the discovery they'd just made against them. "What's your proposition?" Owen asked, ignoring Nora's sharp look. Hollister smiled again, knowing he had their attention. "Simple. Miss Meadows signs over her property to me for the previously offered price. In return, these documents disappear. Her father's reputation remains intact, and she walks away with enough money to start fresh elsewhere." "Blackmail," Nora spat. "That's your game." "Business," Hollister corrected. "I'm offering you a clean exit, Miss Meadows, better than what your father gave his victim." A tense silence followed. Owen could feel the uncertainty radiating from the hands, their loyalty to Nora warring with the shocking accusations. "I'll need time to consider," Nora finally said, her voice steady despite the strain Owen could see in her eyes. Hollister nodded, satisfied. "You have until noon tomorrow. I'll meet you at Elk Creek Crossing." He turned his horse, then paused. "Oh, and don't bother hoping for the territorial marshal to intervene. An unfortunate accident has delayed him in Helena. He won't reach Billings for at least another week." With that parting threat, Hollister and his men rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and uncertainty behind them. The moment they were out of earshot, Nora rounded on Owen. "Why did you ask about his proposition? I'm not selling to that snake." "I needed to buy us time," Owen explained quietly. "Find out what he knows, what he's planning." Hank approached, his weathered face troubled. "Miss Nora, what was he talking about? Your pa's name was John Meadows, wasn't it?" Nora hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "My father was a good man who worked hard to build our ranch," she said firmly. Whatever Hollister claims, he's twisting the truth to serve his own ends. It wasn't a direct answer, but it seemed to satisfy Hank and the other hands for the moment. As they returned to their duties, Nora pulled Owen aside, her voice low and urgent. "He knows everything. How?" Someone must have told him, Owen reasoned, someone who knew your father's past. There's no one left alive who would, Nora stopped suddenly, her eyes widening. Unless my father confided in someone here, someone he trusted. Owen considered the possibility. Hank, he's been with your family the longest. Nora shook her head slowly. Not Hank, he's loyal to a fault, but there was someone else. A man named Frank Dawson. He and Pa rode together for years before settling in this territory. They had a falling out about 5 years ago. Frank left, and Pa never spoke of him again. Could he have gone to work for Hollister? Owen asked. It's possible, Nora admitted. Frank knew everything about our ranch, our finances. Her expression hardened, and he'd know exactly how to hurt us. They spent the night discussing options, speaking in hushed tones while the rest of the camp slept. By morning, they had formulated a plan, risky, but with the potential to turn Hollister's scheme against him. It hinges on whether my father was actually guilty, Nora said as they prepared to break camp. If he wasn't, if Hollister is bluffing or the documents are forged, then we might have a chance. And if he was, Owen asked gently. Nora's gaze was steady, though pain lurked in its depths. Then I'll face that truth when I have to, but I won't let Hollister steal what's mine through lies and threats. They resumed the drive, pushing the cattle toward Elk Creek, which they would reach by mid-morning. Owen rode beside Nora at the head of the herd, both of them scanning the terrain for any sign of Hollister or his men. Whatever happens, Owen said as the creek came into view in the distance, I'm with you. You know that, right? Nora glanced at him, a small smile breaking through her worry. I know, and it means more than I can say. The understanding between them had deepened into something neither had fully acknowledged, a partnership that went beyond the cattle drive or even the fight against Hollister. Despite his long-held belief that the frontier demanded solitude, Owen had found himself inexorably drawn to Nora's strength, courage, and the vulnerability she kept hidden from the world. They reached Elk Creek at 11, giving them an hour before Hollister's deadline. The hands set about watering the cattle while Owen and Nora prepared for the confrontation to come. Remember the plan, Owen said quietly as they watched the horizon for approaching riders. Let me do most of the talking, if it goes wrong. It won't, Nora interrupted with more confidence than either of them felt. Hollister arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by the same men as before, plus one addition, an older man with a craggy face and calculating eyes that Owen immediately distrusted. Miss Meadows, Hollister greeted her with false cordiality. I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. I have, Nora replied coolly. Before I give you my answer, I want to see these documents you claim to have. Proof that my father was Michael Reynolds, wanted for murder. Hollister nodded to the older man who produced a leather portfolio. Frank Dawson was kind enough to provide the necessary evidence, Hollister explained. He and your father were close, I understand. So this was Frank Dawson, the man who had betrayed Nora's father's confidence. Owen studied him carefully, noting the way the man avoided meeting Nora's gaze directly. Dawson stepped forward, extending the portfolio. Your pa wasn't the man you thought, Nora, he said, his voice rough with what might have been regret or merely excellent acting. Michael Reynolds killed a man in Springfield in '66. Shot him in the back over a gambling debt, then disappeared, turned up here as John Meadows a year later. Nora took the portfolio, her face betraying nothing as she opened it and examined the contents. Owen moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The documents appeared authentic, a wanted poster with a crude drawing that did resemble a younger version of John Meadows, a sworn statement from a witness describing the murder, and what appeared to be an official arrest warrant. Well, Hollister prompted after giving her time to read. As you can see, my claims are well-founded. The law would take a very dim view of a fugitive's daughter profiting from his ill-gotten gains. Nora closed the portfolio deliberately, her movements measured. These are very convincing, she acknowledged, almost perfect in fact. Something in her tone made Hollister's smile falter slightly. They're genuine, Miss Meadows. Frank can attest to that. I'm sure he can, Nora agreed, just as he can attest to helping forge them. A tense silence followed her accusation. Frank Dawson shifted uncomfortably, not meeting Hollister's sudden sharp look. That's a serious accusation, Hollister said, his voice hardening, one you can't prove. Actually, I can, Nora countered. She reached into her coat, withdrawing the letter they had found in her father's box. This is a letter to Captain Michael Reynolds from my mother, dated 1863. In it, she mentions that she's expecting their child, me. Owen picked up the thread smoothly. According to your forged documents, the murder took place in 1866, but Nora was born in 1851. She was 15 by the time this supposed crime occurred. Which means, Nora continued, that while my father may indeed have been Michael Reynolds before becoming John Meadows, he couldn't possibly have committed a murder over a gambling debt in '66, then appeared a year later with a teenage daughter. Hollister's face darkened as he realized the flaw in their fabricated evidence. He turned to Frank Dawson, fury evident in every line of his body. You said her age wouldn't matter, that no one would check the dates. Dawson shrank back. I didn't know about any letter. John never mentioned. Enough, Hollister cut him off. His cold eyes returned to Nora. Clever, Miss Meadows, but it changes nothing. I still want your land and I have the means to take it. Through force, Owen challenged, stepping forward. That would be unwise, especially with witnesses. What witnesses? Hollister sneered, gesturing to his armed men who now moved to surround them. Your cowhands against my men. The word of a woman defending her criminal father. Not quite, came a new voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see a group of riders approaching from the east, Ben Johnson at the front, alongside a man wearing the badge of the territorial marshal and 4 deputies. Marshal Davidson, Hollister greeted, his voice suddenly formal though his eyes betrayed his alarm. This is unexpected. I understood you were delayed in Helena. Attempted delay, the marshal corrected, dismounting with the easy confidence of authority. Someone tampered with my horse's shoes, could have broken my neck if I hadn't checked them before leaving, made me mighty curious about who'd want me away from Billings this week. Ben Johnson's weathered face broke into a smile as he approached Owen and Nora. Found the marshal heading this way already, he explained. Seems Mr. Hollister's reputation has preceded him. Marshal Davidson, a tall man with gray-streaked hair and shrewd eyes, surveyed the tense standoff. Mr. Johnson has informed me of serious accusations of cattle rustling, forgery, and attempted land theft. I'd like to see these documents you're using to threaten Miss Meadows. As the marshal examined the forged papers, Frank Dawson edged toward his horse, clearly intending to slip away in the confusion. One of the deputies noticed and moved to block his escape. Going somewhere, Mr. Dawson? The marshal asked without looking up from the documents. I believe I'll want your statement regarding how these papers came to be created. The color drained from Dawson's face. Hollister paid me, he blurted, ignoring the cattle baron's furious glare. Said he'd give me $1,000 to swear John was Michael Reynolds, wanted for murder. It was his idea to forge the documents. Shut your mouth, you fool, Hollister snarled, but the damage was done. The marshal handed the portfolio back to Nora, his expression grave. Forgery of official documents and false accusations are serious matters, Mr. Hollister, as is cattle rustling. I'll need you and your men to accompany me back to Billings. This is absurd, Hollister blustered. I'm the largest landowner in the territory. You can't possibly think. I think, the marshal interrupted firmly, that the law applies equally to everyone in this territory, regardless of how much land they own. He nodded to his deputies, who moved to surround Hollister and his men. You can come peacefully or not, but you will come. For a moment, it seemed Hollister might order his men to fight, his face contorted with rage as he looked from the marshal to Nora. Then, seeing the odds against him, he subsided, though the hatred in his eyes promised this wasn't over. This is a mistake, Davidson, he said coldly, one you'll regret. Add threatening a federal officer to the charges, the marshal replied calmly. Now hand over your weapons, gentlemen. As Hollister and his men were disarmed and prepared for the journey to Billings, Nora turned to Owen, relief and lingering shock mingling in her expression. It worked, she said softly. I can hardly believe it. Owen nodded, watching as Frank Dawson, shoulders slumped in defeat, was handcuffed alongside his employer. Hollister made a mistake common to powerful men, he observed. He thought his money made him untouchable. Marshal Davidson approached them, tipping his hat respectfully to Nora. "Miss Meadows, I'll need you to come to Billings to make a formal statement. Your cattle drive can continue under your foreman's supervision." "Of course, Marshal," Nora agreed, "and thank you." Davidson's stern features softened slightly. "No need for thanks. Just doing my job." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I knew your father, or knew of him at least. He had a reputation as a fair and honest rancher. Whatever name he used before coming west, that's how people will remember him here." The simple words seemed to ease something in Nora. She nodded, gratitude evident in her eyes. After the marshal departed with his prisoners, Nora turned to her hands, who had watched the proceedings with varying degrees of confusion and relief. "The drive continues as planned," she announced. "Hank will lead in my absence. I'll meet you at the railhead in 3 days." As the men returned to their duties, Nora found herself alone with Owen near the creek bank. For a long moment neither spoke, the events of the past days settling around them like dust after a storm. "Will you come to Billings with me?" Nora finally asked, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Owen nodded without hesitation. "Of course." "And after," she pressed, returning to the question he had evaded the night before, "when this is all over, what then, Owen?" This time he didn't avoid the truth that had been growing in him since the day they met. "I've spent years believing the frontier was no place for connections, for caring, that survival meant staying alone." He met her gaze directly. "You've shown me I was wrong." "And what does that mean?" Nora asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. Owen took a step closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her green eyes, the small scar at the edge of her jaw, the hopeful uncertainty in her expression. "It means I'm tired of running from what I want," he said simply. "What I need." "And what's that?" Nora whispered. Instead of answering with words, Owen closed the remaining distance between them. His hand gently cupped her cheek as his lips found hers in a kiss that spoke of all they had endured together and all that might lie ahead. Nora responded immediately, her arms encircling his neck, her body fitting against his as if they had been shaped for each other. When they finally parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "That's my answer," he murmured. "If you'll have me." Nora's smile was like sunrise breaking across the plains. "I believe I will, Owen Vance," she replied. "I believe I will." 3 months later, Owen stood on the porch of the Meadows Ranch house, now the Meadows Vance Ranch, according to the new sign at the entrance, watching the autumn sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Behind him, he heard the door open and close, followed by Nora's familiar step. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arm around his waist. Owen smiled, drawing her closer. "Just thinking how much can change in a single season." Indeed, much had changed. Hollister had been convicted of multiple counts of fraud, cattle rustling, and witness tampering, his empire crumbling as former victims came forward with their own stories of intimidation and theft. The Meadows Vance Ranch had flourished, their cattle bringing top dollar at market, allowing them to hire additional hands and begin improvements Owen had long envisioned. But the greatest change had been their wedding 6 weeks earlier, a small but joyful affair attended by friends from surrounding ranches and Owen's former colleagues from the Rocking W. Ben Johnson had stood as Owen's best man, his weathered face beaming with satisfaction at the union he had helped foster. "Any regrets?" Nora asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Not one," Owen replied truthfully. The man who had arrived at this ranch months ago, convinced that the frontier demanded isolation, had been transformed by love and trust into someone who understood that true strength came from connection, not solitude. "I found something today," Nora said after a comfortable silence, "something I think you should see." She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "It was hidden in a compartment beneath Pa's box," Nora explained. "I found it while cleaning this morning." Owen opened it carefully, recognizing John Meadows' distinctive handwriting. It was a personal journal, beginning in 1866 with a single, startling entry: "Today I bury Michael Reynolds and become John Meadows. The war took too much from me, my brother, my friends, my faith in humanity. I cannot be that man anymore, cannot bear the memories that name carries. For Elizabeth's sake, for our daughter's future, I must leave the past behind and forge something new from the ashes." Owen looked up at Nora, seeing the complex emotions playing across her face. He wasn't running from a crime, he said softly. He was running from his pain. Nora nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Keep reading. The final entry, dated just weeks before John Meadows' death, brought a lump to Owen's throat. Nora is stronger than I ever was, braver too. I've taught her to survive in this harsh land, but I fear I've also taught her my worst traits: distrust, isolation, the belief that vulnerability is weakness. If I could give her one final gift, it would be the knowledge that true strength lies in opening your heart, not armoring it. Perhaps someday she will find someone who can teach her what I never could. Owen closed the journal gently, understanding now the full circle of their journey. John Meadows, once Captain Michael Reynolds, had fled the horrors of war only to build new walls around himself and his daughter. Walls that Nora had begun to dismantle, with Owen's help, as they found in each other what both had been missing: the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to love despite the risks. He would be proud of you, Owen said, drawing Nora into his arms. Of us, she corrected, reaching up to touch his face. We built something here that neither of us could have managed alone. As the last light faded from the sky, Owen kissed his wife beneath the vast Montana stars, grateful for the locked box with its regimental seal that had brought them together and helped them both discover that even on the untamed frontier, the greatest strength came not from isolation but from the courage to love.